The Milgram experiment is one of the most disturbing demonstrations of human obedience ever conducted in a controlled scientific setting. It revealed how ordinary individuals with no history of violence or cruelty could be led to inflict severe harm on another person simply by following instructions from an authority figure. No threats were used. No physical force was applied. Only structured authority and procedural pressure. This presentation explains how the experiment was designed, how obedience overrode moral judgment, and why its findings permanently altered the understanding of human behavior. All information presented here is drawn from original experimental records, peer-reviewed analyses, and documented ethical reviews. Section 1. The purpose of the experiment. The Milgram experiment was designed to answer a central question: why do ordinary people obey orders that cause harm to others? In the aftermath of World War II, psychologists struggled to understand how large numbers of seemingly normal individuals could participate in atrocities without widespread resistance. At the time, many believed that extreme cruelty required sadistic personalities, ideological fanaticism, or pathological aggression. Stanley Milgram challenged this assumption by proposing an alternative explanation. He suggested that obedience to authority itself might be powerful enough to override personal morals, leading ordinary people to carry out harmful actions simply because they were instructed to do so by a perceived legitimate authority. Section 2. Experimental setup. Participants were recruited through newspaper advertisements. They were told the study concerned learning and memory. Each participant was assigned the role of teacher. Another individual, introduced as the learner, was seated in a separate room. The learner was secretly an actor. The teacher did not know this. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks whenever the learner made a mistake. Shock levels ranged from mild to extreme, labeled in increments up to danger, severe shock. No shocks were real, but the teacher believed they were. An authority figure wearing a lab coat supervised the procedure. The experimenter did not threaten the participants. Instead, they used standardized verbal prompts such as, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you go on. You have no other choice. You must continue." The authority figure remained calm, composed, and confident. They did not justify the harm, they simply framed it as necessary. This structure is critical. Obedience was procedural, not emotional. Section 3. Escalation and compliance. As the experiment progressed, the learner began to protest. They complained of pain, they pleaded to stop, they screamed. Eventually, they became silent. Silence was framed as incorrect responses. The teacher was instructed to continue administering shocks. At each stage, participants showed visible distress, sweating, trembling, nervous laughter, hesitation. Despite this, the majority continued. Section 4. Results. Before the experiment, psychologists predicted that only a small percentage of participants would administer the highest shock level. The actual results were far more severe. Approximately 65% of participants continued to the maximum voltage. They believed they were delivering potentially lethal shocks. These were ordinary individuals, teachers, clerks, salespeople, parents. They did not act out of hatred, they acted out of obedience. Now, when we look at the psychological mechanism, the experiment demonstrated a process known as agentic shift. In this state, individuals no longer see themselves as responsible for their actions. Responsibility is transferred to the authority issuing the command. The participant's internal logic becomes, I am not responsible, I am following instructions. Moral judgment is not erased, it is bypassed. The individual's role becomes executing orders, not evaluating them. Section 5. Incremental commitment. Compliance did not happen instantly. It happened gradually. Each shock level increased slightly. Each decision felt only marginally worse than the last. This gradual escalation prevented a clear moral breaking point. Once someone had complied at a lower level, refusing at a higher level felt inconsistent. The experiment exploited this psychological mechanism deliberately. When we look into the emotional conflict, we can see that the participants experienced intense internal conflict. They expressed concern for the learner. They questioned the procedure, they asked if they should stop. But the authority figure's presence resolved the conflict. The experimenter's calm demeanor implied legitimacy. The structured environment implied safety. The scientific framing implied necessity. Emotion lost to procedure. The Milgram experiment generated immediate controversy. Critics argued that the participants were psychologically harmed and that the deception was excessive, which very much made sense. The informed consent was violated. Participants were later debriefed. Most reported relief, some reported long-term distress. The experiment led to sweeping changes in research ethics. Modern psychological studies would not permit such procedures. When we look into the replications and variations, we can see that the experiment has been replicated across cultures, decades, and contexts. Results consistently show high obedience rates. Variables that reduced obedience included absence of authority figure, conflicting authorities, proximity to the victim, peer resistance, etc. But even with these factors, obedience remained significant. Section 6. Psychological implication. The Milgram experiment demonstrates that harmful behavior does not require malicious intent. It requires legitimate authority, structured roles, and diffused responsibility. The danger is not that people are cruel. The danger is that people are compliant. The Milgram experiment revealed a fundamental vulnerability in human morality. Ordinary individuals can commit extreme acts when authority removes personal responsibility. The participants were not abnormal, they were typical. The experiment does not explain evil as pathology, it explains it as obedience. And that conclusion remains one of the most unsettling findings in psychological science. You've just heard one more fragment of how unstable, unpredictable, and fragile the human mind really is. If this case or this disorder changed the way you look at people, that means you're finally seeing what most can't see. New files will be opened soon. More cases. More disorders. More cracks in the human psyche. Until then, stay observant. And if you want more cases, you know what to do. Remember, observation is survival.